Welcome back to another edition of the Founder Spotlight. Today, my guest is Terry, the founder of Cantrip. Welcome, Adam. How are you doing today?
Doing great. How are you doing, Lars?
I'm doing quite well back down in sunny Florida. So that's always good. And so I'd like to start off here, learn a little bit more about your journey and what specifically drew you to the cannabis industry.
Yeah, that's a interesting question. For me, the cannabis industry is probably where I've been headed probably since like high school. I started participating in, consuming cannabis when I was around 17, senior year of high school, and then pretty much from there, I went to college and I joined the Cannabis Reform Coalition here in Massachusetts at UMass Amherst, which was, the pot club activism group there. Then after 4 years of doing that and getting my degree in chemical engineering, while also working, behind the bar and in coffee shops, I moved to California. And then it turned out the only job that I was qualified for was extracting cannabis. Not the only job I was qualified for, but I couldn't get another bartending job in California because they treat them like auditions. They make you have like headshots when you submit resumes, and no one really cared about my previous experience at little bars in Western Massachusetts. So based on my experience with the Cannabis Reform Coalition, my degree in engineering, I ended up working for a company called Curvana out in Santa Ana doing their CO2 extractions and eventually steering them over to cold ethanol. So I kind of got into the cannabis industry pretty much right away after college, which I think puts me in a very rare class of people who've been doing this their entire professional career and going on a decade now. Spent a couple years working out west, moved back to Massachusetts in 2017, worked for a small multi-state operator here in Massachusetts, Temescal Wellness, did all their extractions and product design for a couple years, and then struck out on my own back in 2020 to start Cantrip and sort of marry my interest in bartending and beverage with my interest in in cannabis and developing cannabis products. And at the time, I also was using my own cannabis emulsion recipe to create these products too, which gave a little bit of a leg up because at the time you couldn't really access Vertosa or Source Technologies in Massachusetts because Theory Wellness had Vertosa locked up at the time, and Source wasn't really here yet. So that was how we were able to kind of get off the ground without an emulsion provider.
Yeah, so you mentioned it a little bit there. You created your own emulsion. You have a background as an engineer as well,
And
and then ultimately you started Cantrip in 2020, like you said. So that's an interesting journey going from chemist engineer over to entrepreneur. So can you kind of walk us through what were the key turning points of leading up to ultimately founding Cantrip, and what led you to that decision?
yeah, I think for me, I've been, in cannabis startups my entire career. And if you're in as Curvana is very small when I started, they were doing maybe seven figures annual revenue, maybe low eight. I'm not totally clear on that. But I think if you spend a lot of time in startup environments, you tend to get more familiar with the business aspects of things because you don't tend to have as many resources or as specialized functions as you do in larger organizations. At least out here, I've never been in a larger organizations to actually benchmark it against. Moving into my career on the East Coast, working at the time I was in California, that was all Prop 215, right? So the regulations were nigh on non-existent at that time. And so moving back to Massachusetts, dealing with a lot of regulated states like New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Temescal was still operating in Maryland at the time, I got really familiar with how products come to market, developing these products, bringing them through COGS analysis, and then go-to-market strategy, working with brand designers. When I started up with Temescal, they didn't have any in-house recipes for anything or an extractions lab. So I built them an extractions lab. We started creating recipes. And then I was working with a brand designer to get all of those things. So you really kind of like get a holistic sense when you're in that seat of, how to do the compliance aspects, how to get built from the ground up. What are the important parts about gross margin analysis? And then after a couple of years of doing that and, getting all these things settled in Massachusetts and New Hampshire with Temescal, I started working on corporate development for them. Essentially, it could also just be called business development in the context that I was in, just in the sense that I would set up co-packing contracts for, other licensed states like California, Colorado. So those are two states that we were interested in at the time, and, developing the IP to get all that done. So I really, I guess I spent all my time at Temescal working directly for the CEO of that company. And so that gave me a lot of insight and maybe the confidence that I had not quite yet earned to go out and start something on my own. And so, there was also, I started a distillery here in Massachusetts in 2017. So I had some exposure to kind of getting a business off the ground, starting out, an LLC. But really, it's a lot of learning on the job. So it's not something that I necessarily was totally qualified to do from the beginning, but I did have unique resources available to me and unique knowledge about how to get licensing deals done inside the regulated marijuana space that few people were doing in Massachusetts. Massachusetts at the time, because there were only five. When I started Cantrip, there were only five licensees. I don't even think anyone were actually technically approved when I started Cantrip. By 2021, there were only five manufacturing licenses in the state that were independent and not part of vertically integrated MSOs. And that has grown tremendously since then. But early days, there were pretty much no other brands doing what we were doing. Even Wana, which was in the state at the time, had a sort of different model of licensing. So we had kind of a unique model where we raised enough money to bring in equipment and personnel and set up an agreement with Cloud Creamery, which is a licensed manufacturer here in Framingham, where basically we would go in and manufacture everything and sell through their license. They would collect the cash from dispensaries and pay us for it. And so that was a new business model, and that was kind of the advantage that we had there.
Yeah, so I kind of want to shift gears here a little bit, and recently, you and I are both fairly active on Twitter, or X, whatever you want to call it, and Matt or Mike Lieberman, I can't remember his first name, or I know it's Adam from Morning Brew originally, tweeted about some revenue growth, which ended up being Olipop, and I believe you had tweeted that Cantrip in 2023 and 24. Is tracking to achieve similar success that Olipop had in 2019 and 2020. Kind of with that, what do you think sets Cantrip apart from other beverage brands, and what's contributed to that success and growth?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously we're not necessarily the growthiest or largest company in the hemp beverage space, but we do have a particular few things going for us. So we're really focused on retail presence. And I think what sets us apart from others is our willingness to put boots on the ground in every state that we go into. So we have 3 sales reps in Florida. We had 2 sales reps in New Jersey, and the ultimate number of sales reps we have in New Jersey is going to be determined pretty soon here as they ban it. But every state that we go into with a distributor support model. So that means merchandising in store. It means boots on the ground. It's going to mean a growing field marketing program, and that's a lot slower than growing direct to consumer, but ultimately I think it's going to have a lot of brand staying power, and distributors recognize that, which is why when I make these pitches to distributors, we're able to, at this point, I have no problem contracting the largest distributors operating in the hemp beverage space, which is pretty much now most people short of like Southern Glazers and Republic, like the tier 1 national distributors are still not doing it, but we see a lot of statewide and even multi-state distributors that are now participating in the space, and Cantrip tends to have one of the strongest pitches. And there's a couple other things in that we have a broad SKU set, which allows them to fill out a menu pretty quickly and fill out shelves. That allows us to also maintain sort of a billboard effect in the store so that people recognize the brand, because it takes up an entire shelf to fill all of our SKUs into it. And we have a wide selection for people to choose from, so they don't have to just pick a seltzer. They could also try a soda. We've had energy drinks in the past. And we're not quite on the exact growth trajectory that Olipop is, but we saw 600% growth last year from the previous year. We're on track this year for a minimum 300% growth. I think we can kind of hit similar, low 7 to high 7 to 8, and then onwards. And obviously hemp beverage is a little bit more constrained than Olipop is, because we have a regulatory scheme that's constantly changing. We don't have some of the disadvantages Olipop did, because they were cold chain until I think earlier this year, which is just crazy that they've been able to achieve those revenue numbers. The other thing I liked in comparison with Olipop is that they're also a company that the founder does all the formulations just like I do. So I feel a lot of kinship and resonance with Olipop as a company. But yeah, I think Cantrip's success can be attributed to like really kind of presenting a buttoned up, well thought out, coherent plan to distributors, as well as having, tested products and child resistant lids, and really putting a premium on making sure that we're as compliant as we can be, and that we show up correct. We're not half-assing anything, and we're there to fully support it. And it's expensive and it takes a while, but we've seen tremendous success from it and even decent profitability.
Love that, and congratulations on the sustained success there. I can attest that I have had several of your SKUs, not all of them yet. But most of the seltzers, I believe one of the colas I have a pace sitting in my fridge right now.
Hmm.
Have not quite tried it yet. The energy and 10 milligrams. Uh, I need a good occasion to do it. So
Yeah, well, it's interesting too, because like the energy drink is something that I think we're gonna maybe take a break on for a little while, primarily because it seems like some people are having issues around the concept of caffeine, not from
mhm.
a consumer perspective, but more from a like an insurance perspective, frankly, and some distributors being hesitant about it, which I think is understandable. 10 milligrams also. I mean, really, that product is kind of designed for people who know cannabis and know
Yeah,
exercise, and I think like maybe that's too niche of something to be broadly appealing, but it does do pretty well in certain marketplaces, and we've seen some reasonably good success for it, but resource limited capacity. I think we want to focus on other SKUs first. But I
yeah,
fully intend to have a more expanded line of, functional and, more targeted beverages. But the consumers, I don't think are there yet. There was a lot of like, I think, question marks around people thinking that THC is like a downer in some capacity and that caffeine's an upper, and the same is contradictory. Whereas, I think you and I know that THC is not necessarily a downer. It's
yeah.
a more complicated answer than that. A lot of people use cannabis while they exercise. I actually prefer to consume the seltzers when I exercise because I prefer like a very low dose when I'm doing that. But some people just have higher tolerances.
Yeah, I am excited to try it. Just trying to find the right occasion to do so.
Sure.
So, in previous interviews and things, as I was doing some research here, I've seen you mention, the importance of using naturally extracted THC. Can you explain why this is like a critical aspect of Cantrip's product development?
Yeah, I mean, for us, there's a couple things. First of all, there are states that are banning anything that's artificially created in any capacity. So South Dakota, for an example, Florida technically would have done that in the bill that got vetoed earlier this year.
Mhm.
That's something we're looking ahead at. Ultimately, I don't know how the government was going to enforce or check on that because they rarely understand what they're looking at. But I will say Kentucky is the first state that has asked me for chromatographs, which is not typically posted on our COAs for whatever reason. The lab just doesn't do that.
Mhm.
But I had to obtain chromatographs because they were looking for byproducts. But the ultimate answer to that is that I don't really necessarily know enough about people manufacturing Delta 9 from conversions to be completely clear on exactly what that process is, how they're doing byproduct analysis. So I'm a chemical engineer, right? And one of the things they teach you in basically reaction chemistry class is that anytime you do any reaction, you will create side reactions. A single normal, very standard reaction could have hundreds of byproducts, and they'll occur in smaller and lesser amounts. And part of a chemist's job often is to determine what are the potential reaction pathways. You have two agents reacting. They can make the thing that you're trying to make under the right conditions, but they can also make a whole bunch of other stuff. And so,
Right.
what is the other stuff? How much of it is there? You know, are those trace byproducts okay? And I have not yet seen anybody go into detail about how they do those kinds of analyses, even if they are common in industry for things like, creating vanilla flavoring and such. And so until I see that analysis, I'm not really going to be that confident in Delta 9. But what I have seen in the converted Delta 9, it's converted to Delta 9 usually contains something like a 10-to-1 ratio of D9 to Delta 8. And we don't really want Delta 8 in our product. It's not what we advertise. And so we don't really want it in there at all. So using naturally derived Delta 9, I think it also just hews a little bit more closely to what people expect if they've tried things in dispensaries. Like the
Mhm.
distillate that we use in our Delta 9 contains, small amounts of CBG and CBD and CBC, which are all phytocannabinoids you typically see in these full spectrum extracts from licensed marijuana companies, right? And so
Mhm.
there's more one-to-one feeling effect, I think. Just, ultimately, I think that's the pathway that is best for consumers. It's most recognizable and leads to the least amount of risk for their health. Because to be perfectly honest, we don't have lifetime data for people consuming those kind of products yet, right? And so people talk about, I mean, we don't have to get into the whole synthetics argument, but I don't think necessarily just because it was derived from hemp in some capacity that it's necessarily safe. If you're using an entirely synthetic cannabinoid that was really not even created until 4 or 5 years ago, the latest, you don't know what the toxicity data is on that for long term. We don't have any studies. You may as well be purchasing random research chemicals online, which people do, but it's typically not legal or is legal into extremely limited capacities. And so focusing on the naturally derived Delta 9 prevents the issue from being distracting, I think, to other folks and allows us to make a product that we can feel full confidence in.
Yeah, yeah, that makes complete sense. So you mentioned in that the rules and regulations and different bills keep changing. And most recently, obviously, we had the ban or emergency situation in California. How has yourself as well as Cantrip, navigated all these different challenges and continue to push forward?
Yeah, I mean, the biggest answer is we are going to double down and focus on states where there are permission structures for this more explicitly.
Hmm.
Maybe lean a little less hard in places that are, not as clear. To be honest, California is an odd place in this sense because there was an infrastructure for it in the
Hmm.
law. AB 45 allowed these products to exist even at the protest of the state, saying no, they don't. I mean, the text of the law was pretty clear that it allows products, as long as they're not made from quote unquote THC isolate, to contain Delta 9. And so I would have previously classified California as a safe state until, AB 2223 was up, followed by this emergency ban by Newsom. I mean, ultimately, it seems like the safe states are places without dispensaries because it's just become ultimately clear that marijuana companies, even those participating in hemp, would still rather see it killed in places where they where they can get that done, regardless of whether that's actually an emergency or legal or not. And they use shitty hemp products in gas stations as a cover, which frankly I haven't even seen in a while, to be honest, personally.
Yeah.
But that is always the excuse, is like there's some D8 or THCP being sold in a gas station before, so let's get rid of everything. I mean, ultimately, Cantrip is focused on being good partners to all our distributors, and so when these kind of bans happen, we take product back and we pay for that product, right? And so that costs us not only money in terms of lost sales, but money in terms of taking returns from distributors.
Mhm.
We're fortunate enough, or have worked hard enough to be in a situation where almost always we can find somewhere else to put that product, because frankly we have enough demand that we can reroute product appropriately and then adjust our later production schedules if we need to. The demand has been going up so much across the country that I've almost always been able to find a home for these things, but it doesn't make it any less painful. Ultimately, though, we want distributors, and this part of our pitch to them is like, we want you guys to have confidence that if something changes here, we are going to make sure you're taken care of and not leave you holding the bag, because that's not going to be a good look for the industry. It's not going to be a good look for us. Frankly, there's only something like 1,000 distributors in the entire country anyway, so we wouldn't want to burn a bridge and then, be known as the company doing that. But I don't know that every organization is financially capable of doing that kind of thing. A lot of these
Right.
companies operate on a wire and can't afford to take a return. So, I don't know what everybody else is doing in California, but most likely we'll be taking some product back, assuming this litigation does not work out. But our distribution partners have, for the most part, been very supportive, particular ones in Southern California, saying they're still bullish on the category. They're still excited about it. I heard things like, some of the retailers placing their biggest purchase orders ever the morning before the press conference happens, and then, having to rescind those purchase orders next Monday. And so it's all gone a little bit wacky, but we'll be definitely investing heavily in, Minnesota, Tennessee, most likely Georgia, things like that. And we're just trying to stay ahead of all of that as cleanly as we can. That's a big part of my job as the CEO, is to be as forward looking as possible and trying to predict the future in some capacity to make the best business decisions that we can.
Yeah, and hopefully, Florida's on that list of aggressively expanding, and fingers crossed,
I hope
Delray
so.
Beach.
To be honest, we've invested heavily in Florida, and Florida is still not picking this stuff up as quickly as we like. I don't know what the situation really is, other than that, I think, Total Wine has it. ABC has other hemp beverages, though they have
Hmm.
like a weird way of deciding, I guess, who ends up on their shelves.
Yeah.
I don't want to get into the details, but we thought we'd be on ABC shelves. We're not quite there yet. But beyond those two chains, we haven't seen as much independent pickup as we were hoping for and, relying on. So we are going to keep investing in Florida, but we hope that Florida will keep investing in us in that capacity. So keep telling your friends that these things are available, because I think there's just a lack of awareness problem going on in the Sunshine State.
That's fair. So I always like to end these interviews with, besides Cantrip, what other brands in the space either inspire you or do you personally enjoy?
That's a good question. I haven't drank as many of my competitor brands as I probably should, because I enjoy drinking Cantrip too much, so I'm kind of drinking that most days of the week. But I've had a few heirloom products that I really like. I think Cycling Frog has just some sort of magic to it that they have picked up across this country in a way that is just unfathomable to me. They do a tremendous job in getting retail distribution that I just don't think is that well matched. Delta Beverages is pretty much is up there too. Obviously, Breeze
Hmm.
has done a tremendous job in getting this across the direct to consumer channels, which is a channel that we don't operate in all that much.
Hmm.
And it's really interesting. I really think Trail Magic has something interesting going on there too, and that they've got really great, unique flavor profiles. They were the early adopters of teas, and
Hmm.
then I really like the flavor profiles of Calexo too. I think those are really like exactly what you read on the can is what you get in the liquid, and that's kind of rare these days. Like, it's not as many of these kind of beverages that I actually like the liquid of, though. Kudos to all those brands, but everybody's doing something I think interesting in the space. All of the top brands,
Yep.
and I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that. Like one of the pivotal turning points in this whole industry is when Total Wine picked these things up, because once Total Wine started picking it up and then started expanding into states, it's a lot easier to get a distributor to pick you up if you're promising them, as in California's case, 39 or 41 stores across the state.
Yep.
And so their leadership in this space has been what has driven a lot of things. And Cantrip's Orange Soda is one of their top sellers, which has really, pushed us into a lot of different states. So check out the Orange Soda if you haven't.
I will. And I've tried most of those brands. I've not had the opportunity to try Heirloom yet. I am one of the people that like the flavor of Breeze, but I'm a sucker for literally anything elderflower. Just
Mm-hmm.
toss elderflower in there. I'm going to love it, most likely. Same thing with Calexo. Big fan of them as
Mm-hmm.
well. I have another situation where I haven't tried them yet, but I've only tried the black currant from Cycling Frog so far, and I really like that one.
Yeah, I like their cherry a lot, and it's a little bit sweeter than I think I was expecting for something labeled as a seltzer. But
Hmm.
the word seltzer is so ill-defined these days. Like, I wasn't sure if we would qualify as a seltzer with 2 grams of
Yes.
sugar in there, but it's like clear that there's people with a lot more sugar that call it a seltzer, and also who cares at the end of the day. If you haven't tried Long Coast, their like blueberry mojito is just like out of this world. It's an exceptional flavor profile.
I've only had their margarita from Long Coast, and then
Okay.
for Trail Magic, I've only had their margarita, and so that's the only product from Trail Magic I've had is the margarita. And I did like a little Cinco de Mayo taste test. I think I had like 4 margaritas
Hmm.
from different brands. I enjoyed all of them. I don't know that all of them hit on the margarita aspect of it, but the
Yeah.
flavors of all of them were great, except for Trail Magic. I thought it tasted pretty much exactly like a margarita.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to create because margaritas do rely somewhat on the taste of tequila. You know what I've been meaning to try is Flyers Old Fashioned, see how close
Mm-hmm.
it tastes. It's like I've tried old fashioned formulas and not really managed to hit the nail on the head. And part of that is an old fashioned's like 90% bourbon.
Yeah,
So like, how exactly do you replicate that? So I've been meaning to get my hands on Flyers forever for that
yeah.
reason.
I haven't tried
And
them.
Trail Magic, I think their like special one is the half and half, the iced tea lemonade that they have. It seems
Okay.
to be like a real popular SKU among markets that we see them in.
Okay. I'll have to get them a try. I forget which brand it was. I'll think of it whenever we hang up probably, but they had
Okay.
an old fashioned as well. And, I'm personally not a fan of old fashions, not a fan of whiskey or bourbon,
Mm,
but I thought they did a really nice job of getting like the layers of flavors that you do get from an old fashioned. Just you didn't get the bite that,
Yeah,
is obviously
that's
the
really what I
bourbon.
was missing in most of my old fashioned recipes. The concept I was like, you just don't get the bite. I'm like, I don't know. The only way I can think to do this is add out. It's just like this. I mean, you could try maybe juniper or something like something with like, but that just wouldn't taste like an old fashioned. That would taste like a gin thing. So
Right.
I feel like gin is probably the one of the most easy to replicate kind of
Hmm.
flavor profiles from liquor to non-alcoholic, just because you can do that. You could also, I guess, go through the process of de-alcoholizing like a bourbon, but I don't know what you really end up with afterwards. There's all
Right.
sorts of stuff that I really want to do that I haven't as much time to do lately. I need to open up an actual lab at some point instead of doing all this in my kitchen. The amount of like equipment I have in my house is just kind of crazy.
I can attest to that. More so with photography and videography equipment.
Hmm.
My wife is a saint for allowing me to have as much stuff sitting out
Seriously.
as I have.
And
But
shout out to our wives,
yes.
over here.
Well, thank you so much, Adam. It's been a pleasure talking with you. And until next time, guys, cheers.